Hey guys, it's Barb, and today I'm going to be showing you how you can use a marker base in your color pencil drawings. This is a great technique to try if you're looking for vibrant and quicker results than you would if you were starting right from the white of the paper. Many beginner as well as advanced artists use this technique, so let's have a look and see how you can use it to achieve realistic colored pencil drawings. As with any drawing, choosing appropriate subject matter is going to be key in the success of your results. I find it's really helpful to pick something like a fruit or a vegetable. They tend to be a solid color, but with variations of colors within shadows and highlights. So these tend to be really good images to pick. You can use royalty-free images and create your own reference, or use your own photos if you have them. I'm going to be using Stonehenge paper for this tutorial, but you can use any paper you want that has a smooth surface but still has some tooth. My choice of marker is the Faber-Castell Artist Pitt pens. I'm also going to be using a Caran d'Ache Full Blender Derwent Drawing Chinese White, as well as Prismacolor Premier colored pencils. As I mentioned, I'm going to be using the Faber-Castell Pitt pens, but you can use whatever marker type you prefer. These are my go-to pens because they're light, fast, waterproof, and they have little to no odor at all. This is a really great thing if you have sensitivity to odors. A lot of the alcohol-based markers tend to have quite a strong smell, which can be a little bit much after a while. If you get headaches really easily from strong odors, then these are really great and you don't have to worry about that. As you can see here, I'm just going to fill in the area of the yellow pepper that I'm doing. I'm getting really great coverage with this marker, not a lot of weird patches of color. It's fairly consistent throughout, which is nice. I'm leaving little white gaps in certain areas just to give myself a bit of a guide for where the curves are in the pepper. I can always go back in later and either color over top of them or go over it with colored pencil. But the idea here is that the majority of the base color of the pepper is going to be taken care of by this marker. There's a couple different ways to approach how you pick your markers for your base color. In this case, for the yellow pepper, I've chosen a yellow that's close to the highlights of the yellow of the pepper. And for the red pepper, I've picked something that's more in the middle tone. This is important for considering how you want to achieve your highlights. If you have sort of a more subtle highlight like I do on this red pepper, I can add a white colored pencil over top and that will achieve the brightness that I need. But in some cases, if you have a really bright white highlight and you don't want to use a paint pen or something to achieve that, you might need to leave either the white of the paper showing a little bit like I'm going to here, or you need to get your base color as close to the highlight color as possible. So in the case of the yellow pepper, I've picked a yellow that's very close to what the highlight color is in my reference photo, so that I don't have to work so hard to try and achieve it later. One of the most important things to consider when you're working in colored pencil is that you have to think in layers and think ahead in layers. So in that sense, you have to plan how you're going to tackle an image, how you're going to layer it to achieve the final result. In traditional colored pencil drawings where you're not using any kind of mixed media, you would build up really slowly. You're still building up slowly with this as well. You're just skipping a few steps and not having to worry so much about filling in the white of your paper, and you can just concentrate on those subtleties in the color. Again, the key is to have as consistent as possible coverage with the marker and on your base color, but if for some reason you don't, like with my red pepper here, I'll show you how you can get around that later. We're ready to start doing our colored pencil layers now. I'm going to be using Prismacolor Premier colored pencils, but you can use whatever brand you prefer. This technique is not exclusive to Prismacolor. I've used Faber-Castell Polychromos color pencils with this technique as well, and it's worked just as well. So again, it just depends on your preference, but for this particular tutorial, I'm going to be using those. Starting off with the stem of my first pepper, you can see that I'm just using some of the darker greens to add in some of the shadows and darker areas of the stem. I can also use a yellow green over top of it, and that's showing up quite well. Again, that's the advantage of using a mid-tone. If it's dark enough, light colors will show up fairly well over top of it, but it's still light enough that you can add darker colors and still add some contrast. The more you practice this technique with different colors and different subject matter, it'll become a lot easier to determine what your mid-tone or what your marker base tone needs to be for you to achieve a certain result. And again, this is a really simple kind of basic one, but as you get into more complex subject matter, if you continue to use this technique, that's something that you have to learn to evaluate. It's a really valuable skill to have though, and it'll help you develop a better strategy for how to execute your drawings in the future. For my blending techniques on this drawing, I'm using a combination of building up the layers in lighter layers, as well as burnishing and using the Caran d'Ache full blender. If you're not familiar with the term burnishing, it essentially means taking the colored pencil and applying more pressure to force blend the pigment and colors together. The Caran d'Ache full blender sort of does the same thing, but it's colorless, so it's blending the pigment without actually adding another color as well on top of it. In some cases that might be what you want, so you don't want to add any other extra colors over top. It is possible to burnish as well using a color, and again, those are kind of more complex techniques for another video, but essentially you can handle this a number of different ways. Whichever way works for you, you can use to achieve your end result. One of the things I really love about working in colored pencil is that it really teaches you how to learn to see the subtleties in color, especially when you have to recreate that in your drawing. You really start to evaluate what you're seeing a lot more. The average person would probably look at the reference photo and see red and yellow, but as an artist, of course, we always see all the subtle other colors. In your shadow, there's a red-orange, or in the red pepper, there's maybe some purples, and that's always really exciting to make that discovery and find a way to then recreate that on your page. When you're trying to achieve realism, it's very important that you refer back to your reference photo a lot. That being said, it's okay to go rogue a little sometimes. At the end of the day, you really want to just to pay attention to tone. You want to make sure that you're achieving correct tones, because that's what's going to really sell your realism. If you want to take some liberties with shadows or do things a little bit different, it's okay to do that, but again, you want to make sure you have a really good understanding of what shadows do and how they react with certain objects. Also, reflected light, if it's sitting on a brighter surface, you're going to get a reflected light, or a darker surface, you'll also get a reflected darker shadow perhaps. So those are things to keep in mind if you're going to deviate from your reference photo, because those are the things that will then, I guess, out you on the fact that you deviated from it. But again, if your reference photo looks slightly different than your end result drawing, it's not the end of the world, especially when you're dealing with fruits and vegetables. You're dealing with an organic shape for the most part. If it doesn't have the exact right shape, it's not a huge deal. People will still be able to tell what it is. Where it becomes an issue is with portraits. Obviously, if you're doing someone where likeness is very important, you're not just drawing a random face. You want to make sure that proportions are correct and certain things are correct, because it's important that it look like that person. I'm starting in on the highlights on my red pepper, and I'm using a Derwent Drawing Chinese white pencil for this. I really love this white pencil. I feel like it is one of the most opaque white colored pencils out there. Out of all of the ones I've tried, I find I get the brightest whites on top of other colors with this one. So this is my go-to. It's also great for doing subtle, lighter colors as well, so don't discount it for that, but obviously you play around with the ones that you like, and it's worth seeing what each one does, because you might want to use a different brand for a different effect. I left the areas on my red pepper where there's going to be highlights white for now, but I'm actually going to go back in with the marker and fill them in because I'm going to be able to use the color of the marker underneath to work to my advantage to get the tone that I want out of this highlight. This is again where experimentation is really key with this technique because you can see just what kind of results you can get and what sort of combinations of colors and colored pencils will give you a certain resulted color. As you can see in a moment, I'm going to be using a peach colored pencil to also apply a highlight, and this is nice because it's a warmer, it's almost like a version of a warmer white. It still works really well with the warmer reds that I have in my red pepper, but it's still going to give that illusion of a reflected highlight on the bottom edge. There's a tendency with beginner artists to use black for shadows. This is again where your photo reference comes in really important. Sometimes using a indigo or a really dark purple is actually a more appropriate color. And again, the key here is always to want to sell the realism of the drawing. And in some cases, your darker color isn't going to be black. I didn't use black once in this entire drawing, even though some of the colors, when you're squinting at them, may appear that way, it actually wasn't the color at all. Circling back to the body color of the pepper now, you can see that I'm adding actually quite a bit of orange into the body of this. Again, just goes to show you that a lot of times, you know, people think, well, I'm just seeing red, but when you really look, you can see there are some lighter oranges and even a bit of a yellow. And the more that you use colored pencil and the more that you understand what colors blend and create different colors, the easier it'll be for you to pick and choose what you want to use to create your drawing. A lot of times people ask, well, what are the right colors to use? And everyone's going to approach it a little bit differently. Some colored pencil artists will use more of what I would say is a painter's method, where they're using complementary colors to create certain tones, where somebody else might try to achieve it a totally different way. And it's not necessarily right or wrong, it's just the way that your mind works and the way that you want to achieve it. There's obviously better ways to get certain results, but again, you have to just do your research and or experiment to figure out what it is that you want to achieve and what look you want with your artwork. As I mentioned earlier, if your marker base isn't as solid as you would like it to be, you may need to do a few more layers of colored pencil than you would on, say, a different area that was a little bit more consistent. Like in this example, the yellow pepper, the color was quite consistent, so it wasn't as challenging. However, on the red side, I have to do a few more layers just to make sure that it's not having that weird patchy paper coming through look. It's working to my advantage a little bit in this case because the red pepper actually had a lot more subtlety and nuances in the color, so I just need to use my layers a little bit more. And again, lighter layers work best here, so you're not completely flattening the tooth of the paper. That's another thing to consider when you're using a blender or a burnishing method, is you have to kind of know when to use it, because it can flatten your tooth and then you're sort of stuck, or you have to use a spray fixative to give yourself some traction again. And here's a final look at the results of my drawing using a marker base. Again, I could push this a little bit farther if I wanted to, but I'm happy with where it's at the moment. I really love that marker-based drawings can either get to really high levels of realism, or they can still look a little bit illustrated or like there's a human touch to them. That's one of the advantages of this technique. You can kind of go either way. It's definitely worth trying out, so Don't be afraid to experiment. If you decide to do your own version, please tag me on social media at barbsodiart. I'd love to see your drawing, and I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Thanks so much for watching. If you like this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and please subscribe. And I'll see you next time.